Please welcome the Executive Vice President and Provost of Stony Brook University, Carl Lejuez.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Stony Brook University's presidential lecture featuring Frances Haugen, a tireless advocate for accountability and transparency in social media. It's my pleasure to be together in person with so many students, faculty, staff, and members of our local community. We're also pleased that we have so many guests here joining us via our live stream as well. Now, we are a community of scholars, so I imagine you have figured out that I am not President Mari McGinnis. She sends our regrets. She's not feeling well today, so I will do my best to fill her shoes. And as we think about the bravery and courageousness of our speaker today, this is how I think about our president, so I will do my best. I'd like to recognize the Children and Screens Institute of Digital Media and Child Development and its members and guests in our audience today. And this includes the organization's founder, Dr. Pamela Hurst Della Pietra. Now, you know this, but Pam and her family are essential members of our Stony Brook community. I know that there are many here today who remember that Pam was the first to call us in March 2020 to offer her and her family's assistance in starting a fundraising challenge related to the pandemic. We are so grateful to have their support in that challenging time and as we move forward together. And thank you again. Now, later this evening, Pam will be honored during the Children and Screens 10th anniversary celebration. Because of Pam's great insight and acumen about the need to truly understand the cognitive and long-term impacts of frequent technology use on children a decade ago, Children and Screens is at the forefront of its field today and truly doing great work in helping us through these challenging times. The Stony Brook campus community has certainly been looking forward to our event today and Frances Haugen's visit and the opportunity to hear a story that illuminates the need for transparency and that highlights her advocacy and bravery. As Frances continues to combat misinformation and the misuse of online content, her work has elevated public awareness of social media's impact on children and adolescents. It's because of Frances and advocates like her, the world is beginning to grasp the critical importance of reforms to keep young people safe, using social media as a tool for good and a tool that unites instead of divides. Frances holds a degree in electrical and computer engineering from Olin College and an MBA from Harvard University. Her professional resume includes roles as a former algorithmic product manager at Google, Pinterest, Yelp, and Facebook, where she was recruited in 2019 to be the lead project manager on the civic misinformation team that dealt with issues related to democracy, misinformation, and counter-espionage. In 2021, as a former employee of Facebook, Frances anonymously shared documents with the Wall Street Journal. She later provided more than 20,000 pages of documents to the Securities and Exchange Commission and to Congress. She filed a series of federal complaints related to Facebook, now Meta, claiming that the company has been misleading the public and investors on how it handles issues such as climate change, misinformation, and hate speech, and the impact of its services on the mental health of children and young adults. Since going public, she has engaged with lawmakers nationally and internationally on how to best address the negative effects of social media platforms. We are fortunate to have Frances with us to share her story today, including her vision for how we can solve these problems and move together building social media that brings out the best in humanity. So now I'd like to ask you to please join me in welcoming Frances Haugen to begin our lecture.
Good afternoon. My name is Frances Haugen, and I work on bringing transparency and accountability to large tech platforms. A lot of you may have seen the news coverage last year around the Facebook files. So those 20,000 pages of documents turned into hundreds of pieces of reporting from some of the largest newspapers around the world. When you read through that amount of reporting and kind of how visceral some of the things that are discussed in it, things like Facebook knew the drug cartels in Mexico were using their platforms to exert chaos, recruit people, maintain their control. That they knew that kids' mental health was being harmed, that children were describing their relationships with it like an addict's narrative, that they couldn't stop themselves, that they felt horrible using it, but they felt if they left, they would be marginalized. That Facebook knew that their algorithms were influencing what political parties could even promote because changes they made to the algorithm for their business interests were causing political parties to talk about different issues because the issues they had been talking about, posting a white paper on their agricultural policy, it didn't matter that people had been reading it before. Now it would just be crickets if they put it out there. Facebook knew about all these things but didn't act. And now years passed, and we still don't have a law in the United States, not even like a basic transparency law. And so it's very easy to look at all this and say, how could there have been such a big splash and we haven't seen the outcome yet? Well, first off, we have seen a huge outcome, which is in Europe, a landmark generational law got passed called the Digital Services Act. So when people talk to me about the problem of social media, I'm always really, really careful to dig in with them on what do you mean the problem of social media, right? Because everyone has their kind of take on what's their biggest grievance with social media. My biggest, what I consider the problem of social media, the Digital Services Act is trying to really zoom in on. And that problem is that when these platforms were designed, when the trade-offs that went into building them were being made, there weren't enough people at the table. And there weren't enough different people at the table. The Digital Services Act doesn't come in and say, this is what you can say online, this is what you can't say online. It comes in and says, hey, we have been operating in a world that is fundamentally asymmetric for the last 20 years. Because remember, there were social media platforms before Facebook. Did anyone in this room ever use Friendster? Anyone? And we got a couple of hands. I'd say MySpace, but that's less OG. So we've been having social media for at least 20 years, longer if you consider some of the things from the 90s or even bulletin boards from the 80s. That entire time, at least when we had centralized, privately owned platforms, the only people who got to see how those platforms operated were the companies that owned them. Especially once we started having algorithmic feeds that fed each of us different content. If you open your phone and look at Facebook, and if I open my phone and look at Facebook, we see different things. You have no idea if what you see is representative. I have no idea if what I see is representative. People have been asking Facebook for, at least since 2008, when they started having the algorithmic feed, for data. To say, hey, we know there are different ways to build these products. And right now, you're making all the choices around how they're built. You're making all those internally. We want to at least see what the consequences are. We have very, very small amounts of data. Can you tell us what the 1,000 most popular posts are in the United States every week? Right? These are, no one's privacy is being violated here. These are all pieces of content that have been seen by 10 million or more people. Right? I don't think anyone who wrote one of this post is going to be oh, I'm going to grab my pearls. An academic somewhere looked at my post. This is not, there's no reason not to give this data. But Facebook has refused to give this data for at least 10 years, if not 12. The Digital Services Act is the first step in a government around the world acting in response to the information that was in those disclosures. They came out and said, hey, here's the deal. You like to think that you're a sovereign entity, but in fact, You are not. You have your offices around the world. They are not embassies, they are offices. And if we ask you a question like, how many moderators speak our language, you need to tell us. And it has been made very clear to us that you have lots of research on how these products are harmful, and you're not showing it to us. It's kind of like back in the 80s when we discovered the cigarette companies had known for 20 or 30 years that cigarettes were making cancer worse, and they hid it. Or worse, they said to the public, no, there's nothing here. It's a nothing burger. So the first thing is the Digital Services Act says, hey, we're going to ask you every 6 months, what harms do you know about your products? And you're going to tell us. And the second says, hey, we're going to start a Hubble, like Hubble telescope, but for social media. There's going to be this research center, and we're going to have a small number of highly vetted people who are going to come in there and be how the public asks questions. So if an academic wants to ask a question about the platforms, they can write out a grant, and they can send it to the Hubble of social media, and we can get back some data. So we can start asking independent questions. And all these things are meant to target what I think is the problem with social media, which is we don't know what's going on, right? The public, the average person doesn't know what's going on. Back in 1965, a book called Unsafe at Any Speed was written and published by a guy named Ralph Nader. And I went and looked up what Ralph Nader looked like in 1965, and he was young. I was like, wow, I'm a millennial. Ralph Nader has only ever been like an elder statesman to me, right? But I was like, wow, there's like this young lawyer. He's been sitting there and like kind of interested in automotive safety since he was in law school. He's like, gosh, these cars, like there's a lot going on here. And he ended up being able to look through 100 lawsuits about a single car called the Corvair. So the Corvair was supposed to be the first like high performance lightweight car in the United States. So it was made out of aluminum, very novel. It's supposed to be all aluminum, but these things happen, trade-offs happen, and the engine ended up being made of steel, or parts of the engine being made of steel, and suddenly the balance of weight in this car was off. And it meant that the car was prone to tipping over. Instead of addressing this, and they sold parts that you could do to address this. Like if you knew this car was unstable and you wanted this car to be more stable, you could buy a part from GM and make it safer. But they didn't fix it until after this book came out. So Ralph Nader puts out this book, and the book is kind of like what I'm saying now. It's, guess what? We have felt powerless about automotive fatalities. Back in 1965, cars were about 3.5 times more dangerous than they are today. So think about how many people died in car accidents. And for context, since 2000, more Americans have died in car accidents than all of the wars we fought in the 20th century. Contemplate that, just in the last 20 years. It used to be they were way more dangerous. And they were getting more dangerous every year. The fatality rate had been going down for years and years and years. And in the 60s, when they started making bigger cars and like more chrome on things, turns out in a car accident, hitting a chrome surface is not the safest thing in the world. That cars started getting more dangerous. More people started dying, even proportionate to how much we were driving. So he puts out this book and he says, guess what? The automotive industry knows how to make cars safer. Every year people are dying because they're literally getting impaled on their steering columns. And the automotive industry has known for years that they could have collapsible steering columns, the things that hold your steering wheel, and that they cost about the same. Or that you could have seat belts. It sounds so novel to us, like, wait, there weren't seat belts? Yeah, no cars had seat belts. Like, seat belts were like an amenity that 2-3% of people paid extra money to buy. There were no seat belts. The automotive industry knew that seat belts saved lives. So you're like, so why wouldn't they do it? It's kind of like with Facebook today. We know lots of ways that aren't about content moderation of making these platforms safer. Why don't they do it? So many of the things that are happening today about the dangers of social media are very similar to what cars were like in 1965. You had different automotive executives at different companies, all like kind of, they knew they could do better, but like if they were the first mover, would people think that their product was more dangerous than the other products? No one else is talking about safety. Like, why do you need a seatbelt? Is your car more dangerous? That was the rationale going on inside of these places. And as a result, they were spending the equivalent of $6,000 in today's dollars per car on superficial styling changes every year, and the equivalent of about like $25 on safety features, right? Totally skewed. Today, there's some really, really low-hanging fruit. We can find every 13-year-old on these platforms. It's trivial, right? Guess what? Kids are not bright. They do things like put in their profiles. I'm a 4th grader at Jones Elementary. Kids report each other to punish each other, right? Can you just imagine being like an 11-year-old and being annoyed with another 11-year-old? Like, haha, your Instagram account is mine. We can find enough kids under the age of 13 that we can make machine learning models, AIs, that can find all the other kids. The reason why we don't take under 13-year-olds off these platforms is not because we can't. And to be really clear, the research today is not, there's no conversation. Like, the most dangerous phase of time for kids is when they go through puberty. From 10 to 13, they start having more oxytocin, more dopamine receptors in their brains. It makes them even more susceptible to like the joy of a great compliment or like the pain of a diss. And unlike schools and bullying, schools and kids being mean to you have been true forever. But it used to be you could go home, right? It used to be you could go home at 3 and you got 16 hours before it began again. Or if someone said something mean to you in the hallway, it stayed in the hallway, it disappeared. And now when something happens, it lives on, it's permanent, it's not ephemeral. The reason why tech companies don't keep the under 13-year-olds off their platforms is they're scared that if they're the first mover, they will give up on the next generation. And you see this with things like TikTok. TikTok comes in and says, no, we have like a kid-safe version. You can have your 6-year-old on TikTok. Come on in. That's why Facebook wanted to build Instagram Kids. They're scared that people are building relationships with these products when they're, less than 13, and that they won't want to use Instagram by the time they're 13. So we need to step in and say, what are the systemic issues around these platforms? Like, they can't be allowed to be opaque anymore. They have to tell us what they know. The public has to be allowed to ask questions and actually run experiments, get answers. Because in 1965, when Unsafe at Any Speed had been written, they were actually way far ahead than we are. Because in 1965, we had had graduate degrees in automotive engineering for like 30 years, right? There were thousands and thousands of people who you could call and put on the stand and say, hey, can you explain to me this collapsible steering wheel thing? Or we'd had people studying physics for hundreds of years. If you said to someone, hey, this is how a seatbelt works, this is why it saves lives. Instead of having the car decelerate and then the person keep flying at 60 miles per hour and then hit the car, it goes with the car. Right now, because we have been denied the chance to form our own opinions, the public has been denied the chance to build a public muscle of accountability. We're standing in a world where there are only maybe thousands of people in the world, maybe hundreds of people in the world, who understand even the physics of why we would want a seatbelt in social media. Because no one is allowed to study these things. No one is allowed to learn about them and that physics, except people who come up inside the companies. So I think there's a lot of opportunities. Like, one of the things we want to build in the next couple of years is a simulated social network. So we could have, we're never going to give 18-year-olds real social media data. You don't want your 18-year-old like spying on what you do. We're never going to do that. But if we had a simulated social network, we could teach classes where people actually got exposed to like how does our information environment run? We could have data science clubs in high schools, just like we have high school newspapers. We have junior high school newspapers. And let's be honest, we do not have junior high school newspapers because they produce good journalism. We have them because we believe we can only have a democracy if we expose people to the process of our information environment. In a world where we have simulated social networks, you can have kids argue over, should you have to click on a link before you reshare it? Sounds really simple. It's like 10 or 15% less misinformation. If you say no, you have to actually look at the thing before you spread it on further. But Twitter did it and Facebook didn't do it. And I think the reason for that, I don't know for sure, is that Facebook's users on average, globally, are much less literate than Twitter's are. It may not seem that way, but just trust me. There's at least 1 billion users on Facebook that are very minimally literate. And so it's these kinds of things where if we want to live in a democracy where these tech companies are living in democracy's house, we need at least 1 million people who can, in a meaningful way, contribute to the conversation on like how these platforms should be run. Because I am not a solution. I'm a single person. And coming in and saying, we should just do what Frances says, that's no better than doing what Mark Zuckerberg says. What we need is to figure out how are we going to live with these technologies in a way that is democratic and accountable. So thank you for inviting me today. And I invite Provost Lejuez, yes, up to the stage to have a conversation. I had it on paper just in case.
And I told her she could say Carl, so I thought, just in case. But
I'm a Haugen, and like so many people mispronounce my name that I feel determined to try to give
it was
people,
it was great. So, thank you for sharing your story, for the courage that went into it, and just continuing to push forward. And there's probably many things that none of us know about what you've had to go through. And so we are just really grateful to have you here to hear your story, but also spur conversation in our community. And one of the things that you raise is also what can we do following this? What are ways in which our scholars, others in our community, so there's lots of great opportunities for us to build here. But we're here now to ask you some questions, so I'll move to that. So this first question, when we think about the decision you made to disclose the information to the Wall Street Journal and then the SEC, what was that moment? What was that tipping point, and what was that process like?
So I had begun to have concerns about what Facebook was doing as far back as the Iowa caucuses. So 2020 Iowa caucuses, I grew up in Iowa, and I was actually a caucus staffer. Like I worked on a campaign back in like 2004. And they were rolling out software that was supposed to be what was going to run our war room, like it's called Integrated Product Operations Center, because they love long names. And it was basically the tooling to be like, how do you know if a problem's happening? And that tooling had been around for at least a couple of years and had been used in like the Indian national election, the European parliamentary elections. The problem was it was designed for national elections and not a state election. And Iowa makes up about 1% of the population. And when I found out only in around December 17th of 2019 that they were not going to be able to segment by states in time for the Iowa caucuses. And just because they were running behind, they hadn't put enough resources into it, all these things. And when I met with the person about like, okay, so like we're going to catch up, like we're going to start having states, like, so how's that going to work? And she's like, well, cutting all the data by states, it's a lot more expensive than having it just for the whole US as a whole. We only have budget to do 10 states at a time. And I was like, cool, so like you're going to start with like the early primaries and like caucuses, and you're like, swap them out as you go along, right? And she's like, oh, no, we're going to do the swing states. And I looked at her and I go, you're going to do the swing states? And I was like, are you aware only the Democrats are voting? Right? Like, Trump was the candidate in 2020. Like, all the Republican states and all the swing states were not as valuable. Like, you're going to miss out California and New York, for example, for support, or New Jersey for that matter. And she looked at me and she went, why would that matter? Like, she had little enough understanding of how like civics works that she didn't understand like the fact that only the Democrats were voting would have a relationship to those things. And it made me realize like how in over Facebook's head it was. But the moment where I decided I needed to act was I'm a rare technologist that has an MBA. And I took a class on change management. I know, talk about an MBA topic. It's like change management. You too can be a consultant one day. But one of the things they talked about in there was like, it's so hard for individuals to change. The only way an organization can change is if you appoint a vanguard. So usually they call them like a center of excellence or something like that. You say, these guys are doing it the right way. They're the future. You can either fall in behind them or you can leave. Like, that's your options. And for a long time, Facebook did that. So they formed this thing called Civic Integrity after 2016. And for 4 years, they built it up. They invested in it. And less than a month after the election, they dissolved the unit. And that was the moment where I was like, I don't think Facebook can save itself, right? Like, if you came out of the 2020 election being like, oh, we're done, like there was no rioting, therefore we're good to go, like, you don't understand like what your products are. And so that was the moment where I was like, oh, I'm going to have to do something.
And so if one of the strengths here at Stony Brook is in our economics department, we have great theorists in game theory. And so you think about decision-making processes. So as you're approaching this point where you're at the tipping point and you're deciding to do this, you're probably thinking about, what do I hope comes out of this? And so now looking back, what did you hope come out? Did that actually happen? And what are some of the things that you wish would happen and hope will in the future?
So I had incredibly low goals. So like my core goal was I wanted to be able to sleep at night, right? That I think there's a thing where I think a lot, if more young people thought about the idea that you can make decisions that you will still be thinking about 20 years from now, right? If like we reminded more people, like there's decisions in your life you might still be thinking about 20 years from now, you would think a lot harder about them. And for me, because I thought, and I still think this, that there's 20 or 30 million lives likely on the line in the next 20 years, right? That when you look at the level of neglect that is happening in African countries, in Southeast Asia, when you look at the fact that Facebook has gone into these places and paid for the data for people to use Facebook's products, but not paid for data for using other things. And Facebook has become the internet for the most vulnerable billion internet users in the world. Like we're still living in that possible future, like where that may end badly. I felt like my life in some ways was already over, right? That if I didn't act, and it did go as badly as I thought it would, that I would blame myself. Like I could have acted. And so even just acting, it gave me, like it was very freeing. But the secondary thing was like, I think things have gone far better than I ever thought they would, right? So the rollout I'm so glad that the world cared, right? Because I just didn't know. And I'm amazed that Europe was able to get the DSA over the finish line. Like they've been trying for 4 or 5 years to make this bill a reality. And they responded much more viscerally to the disclosures because one of the core things that was in them was that Facebook was disproportionately spending money on safety in English, even though only about 9% of users spoke English. And understandably, this was unacceptable to Europe.
Yeah, so, I mean, I hear a lot in what you're saying about mental health. At first it's your decision about how do I sleep at night, how do I do that? But if we think about some of what kind of really pushed you to make these hard decisions, talk a little bit about the impact of mental health on adolescents, particularly young girls in some of these cases. How was that an important piece, and what is your hope in terms of having a better platforms that support mental health instead of threatening it?
Part of what's so frustrating for me about the mental health conversation is that if we were to sit there and begin picking off, kind of what are the factors that are driving this problem, some of them are things like these products. There's a business incentive for these platforms to keep your kid on them as long as possible, right? That because they are advertising supported, they're not like Netflix, for example, has an incentive for you to only watch as much TV as you actually want to, because they have to pay so much for data that they actually don't want you to binge watch too late at night, because you might stop subscribing to them. Facebook, on the other hand, their money comes from how long you stay online, right? So someone who stays up till 2 makes more dollars from them than someone who goes to bed at 10. And part of what frustrates me so much about it is that it's completely fixable. So when I worked at Google in the mid-2000s, we obsessed over tiny amounts of latency. So if the website was, if like one version of Google versus another was 10 milliseconds slower, that was a big deal. And the reason for that was they had run experiments where small amounts of speed difference led to substantial differences in how often people searched. That if people expected it to be slow, they searched less often. Right now, a few platforms, like TikTok is one, if you're on for more than, I think, 90 minutes, 100 minutes, they will pop up a little thing saying, do you want to take a break? I don't know about you. YouTube has this as well. They have a bedtime one. It says, hey, do you want to go to bed? And you may be a better person than me, but when I get that, I put dismiss. But let's imagine a different way of approaching this. So, when things get slower, people use them less. Imagine you have a kid, they're 16, they've stayed up till 2 on Instagram, they're like all hungover in math class the next day, and a little thing pops up on their phone saying like, hey, when do you want to go to bed tonight? And they're like 11. My mom wants to go to bed at 10, I want to go to bed at 11. And for 2 hours before that bedtime, Instagram got a little bit slower, and a little bit slower, and a little bit slower, and a little bit slower. You didn't even notice it was getting slower, right? Just kind of like it was almost like there's a little more inertia when you move things. It's very easy to do this. You can see demos of it. Around their bedtime, they would just get tired and go to bed. We could launch this 2 weeks from now. Like the code is already live on Instagram. So if you're stealing content from Instagram, they don't take your account down. They just slow your account down. Because if they take your account down, you'll get a new account. The only reason why they don't do it is if they came out and said, we need to help kids go to bed, like we know we have a problem, we know we're sticky, parents would start to ask questions about the platform. It's just like those car companies being afraid about being the first mover. This is one of the reasons why we need to have the ability to force Facebook to publish data. If they had to publish how many under 18-year-olds were on the platform at 2 a.m. every month, every week, we would ask questions. We'd be like, why are there so many 16-year-olds on the platform at 2 a.m.? Because you know, insomnia is one of the top risk factors for mental health issues for kids, for bad performance in school, literally dying in accidents of all kinds. Substance use, both uppers and downers. Uppers because they're tired, downers because they're crabby. So this is a real thing. And there's a bunch of things along those lines where we can put choices back in the hands of people using these platforms. Because I guarantee you, if you launch that feature, there's lots of adults that would use it too.
So what I love about what you've talked about there is kind of taking the technology and the programming that would lead a teen to use more and use more dangerously. Now you change that. In the same way, we've talked a lot about the algorithms and how that leads to more negative content, more misinformation. What are some of your thoughts about using the algorithms for positive?
So there's things where, so I think you always need to, we like to say the algorithms, but we always need to say the algorithms and the design of the products. Because they actually go very intimately together. So for example, let's say we're going to talk about sharing. So the algorithms, the issue with them is all machine learning systems only optimize for what you tell them to optimize for. And they'll take whatever path they want to get there. And that path may not be what you want at all, but they're going to make your metric go up. And in the case of extreme information, so that could be misinformation, it could be violence, it could be hate speech, it could be pro-anorexia content, pro-self-harm content. The algorithm will take things that are adjacent to what you're looking at, but a little bit more extreme and have a bias towards them. And I'll give you an example. I talked to a journalist who had a baby, cute baby boy, healthy, very lovely baby. He made an Instagram account for the child. That account had a few other friends who were all also babies that the family knew. All these are healthy, happy, cute babies. The only thing anyone has posted to this account are healthy, cute, happy babies. The only thing clicked on was a happy, cute, healthy baby. And yet about 10% of the content in this account was horribly mangled children. Like children in hospitals, dying of cancer, tubes coming out of them, critical malformities, accidents. And he was like, why am I being shown this? Like, I don't understand. Like, I have never shown any inclination that I want this. And it's because, I'm guessing what it is that Instagram almost certainly has a dwell signal in its algorithm. So like if you pause or like spend a little more time on content, that's considered engagement as well. And the reality is, if you have a small child, it is very hard for you not to pause when you see another child suffering, right? And so it's one of these things where the algorithm, all it knows is it wants you to dwell more, click more, all those things. It doesn't realize what it's doing is inappropriate. So some of the ways in which you can take a step back from those systems is, at least in the case of things like depression or body image issues or self-harm, Instagram has something called a topic model. So that means they take all the content that exists in the world and they put it into a smaller number of themes. And Instagram has run experiments where they go through and they show people examples from those topics, and they say, how does this make you feel about X? Or, does this make you feel sad? That kind of thing. And if we know the algorithms can concentrate emotions, so you're kind of feeling a little blue, and now it keeps showing you more and more blue content. Imagine if it popped up a thing saying, hey, we notice you've been looking at more stuff like this. Do you want to keep looking at that much stuff? Or would you like a little bit less? Or would you like us to take it out altogether? Because one of the things that I hear from psychologists, especially ones that support children with eating disorders, is that the kids say, I'm trying to make better decisions, but it follows me across Instagram. Right now we're asking kids to choose between their pasts, their friends, the content that documented their lives, and their futures. Because they could destroy their accounts and get a new algorithm. Little tiny things like saying every person is allowed to reset an algorithm and what the algorithm thinks it's knows about you. That should be a right that everyone has. And even I've experienced this. Like I got quite sick in 2014, and I always like to joke, like, blowing the whistle on Facebook is not actually the hardest thing I've done in my life. Like, I was sick enough that I spent 2 months in the hospital. I had to relearn to walk, a whole 9 yards. And I must have watched a whole bunch of very dark content on Netflix for a couple of years. Because at some point, I got healthy enough that I was like, wow, Netflix is so depressing. Like, every time I opened it, we had like a family thing, so like my mom was paying for it, so, I didn't care if I only did it occasionally. I'd open it, I'd be like, God, why does anyone watch Netflix? And then I moved in with some other people, and they had a Netflix account. I was like, oh, Netflix is great. There's like so much stuff on it. And so I think it's just one of these things where what computers think they know about us is only as much as the people who program those systems understand about the human condition. Right? That if we don't program in the idea that people grow or change, the algorithm is always going to try to, keep going on the trajectory that it thinks it knows about you.
And I just love what you talked about in terms of the idea of giving anyone the opportunity to make a decision far away from when it's going to have its consequence. So saying what time you want to go to bed early
when you have willpower.
Much more likely to make that. So that's just really exciting to think about how you have stepped into things that are very commonplace in a lot of ways, but also really brought in information to combat misinformation, scholarship to do that. I actually don't have a question with that. I was just so excited. I wanted to share that. But you did also talk a lot about parents. And parents, in many ways now, are really desperate to know where to go when they are struggling with their kids.
Totally.
And particularly as we have more challenges with shortages of mental health practitioners. I would imagine many parents have reached out to you, and I'm just curious what that experience has been like.
So I think the most important advice I have for parents, and I think this is actually a thing where we as a society have to start, this is a great thing for your students if they want like a project to noodle on. Right now, we talk a lot about solving these problems in the context of a child or a family. And in reality, they are what we call network-based problems. Right? Like if a single child says, I want to spend more time with my friends, they can't actually make that choice by themselves. If their friends all think all their other friends only want to hang out online, it's very hard for them to be like, no, we could hang out in person, And so I think there's an opportunity where we need to start going into, instead of saying like parents need to be the ones to save their kids, we need to start saying like, let's go into a school and like, let's run them through a bunch of games and be like, hey, this is what the business model is. Like, this is how algorithmic amplification, like escalation works. Like, this is what it means to privatize a problem versus socialize a problem. Like, this is what it means to do collective action. And you bring all the kids into an auditorium and you poll them live. And you say, how does this make you feel? And you put the graph up on the board. And it turns out lots of people feel bad about this. And you say, how much do you use it every day? You put that number up on the board. Ask them, how much, if you could set the rule for the school, where, we tell the PTA, we're all gonna put rate limiters on our phones. This is how much social media we as a community want to do per day. What number should that be? And you let the kids, govern because if you try to enforce the solution on them, it's not going to work. I just wonder what would happen. Because when you talk to kids, they feel powerless. They feel like that they're in this like Mexican standoff, like that if they act first, it just means they're going to be alone. And that's like an almost impossible choice for a kid. And part of why I think we have to do this is I've talked to the parents who are living the consequences of us not doing it, right? So kids who have died in viral challenges. Speaking of cars again, if there was a car and it was slightly misdesigned and a couple hundred kids broke their arms in ways that were considered unnecessary, that car would get recalled, right? There'd be lawsuits. And there are single viral challenges where hundreds of kids die. And it's things where you can look at them and be like, well, that kid was dumb. It's like, really? All teenagers are dumb. That can't be the standard. If there's a challenge where you're saying why don't you try choking yourself because it's fun when you black out? That's just irresponsible. We would never put that on TV for a reason. And so I think it's one of these things where we have to start having these conversations about how do we facilitate kids reclaiming some of their agency. How do we facilitate kids caring for each other? Because a thing that was invisible to me until I started talking to child psychologists is we are living in a dawn of a new era in that nonprofits are being formed to teach kids how to play pickup basketball, right? Think back through time. How many kids needed a nonprofit to teach them to play pickup basketball? But that's because it was slightly different. So back, let's say 20 years ago, 30 years ago, most kids didn't have cell phones. If you wanted to play pickup basketball, you had to show up at the park, and there might or might not be enough 14-year-olds to play. And if there weren't enough 14-year-olds, you were going to have to let the 12-year-old play. And they were bad, right? And now, all the kids only show up on Tuesday because they have a group chat with their friends, and everyone says if they're coming or not, and they know they have enough people, and they only show up when they do. And now the 12-year-old doesn't get to learn how to play pickup basketball. We have to acknowledge we are living in a different environment than we did 30 years ago. And we're going to have to figure out how to respond to it.
If there was only a nonprofit to teach pickup basketball, it all could have been different.
Yeah.
Anyway. So much that's valuable today is what you've said, but, it's also what you did and what that means in terms of being a role model, what that means in terms of showing others what's possible. We have a lot of students here today. What is your advice to them about when they see injustice, when they see things that they are troubled by? How do they think through the decision and act on the decision to stand up to that?
So I think one of the most important things that we can do for students is we need to do education on what are your rights. Because even between when I graduated from college, or about when I started college, right when I started college, the first whistleblower laws were even passed in the United States, right? It's been in my adult lifetime that we've gone whistleblower laws. In Europe, they had no whistleblower laws until last December, a year ago. Which happened directly as a result of my whistleblow. So just like Enron led to the ones here, same thing. We are living in a very different time than we lived in 1965. So in 1965, anyone could buy a car and take it apart. Anyone could buy a car and crash it. Anyone could buy a car and put sensors on it. Lead gasoline, we could analyze lead gasoline because we could control, we could get the product, we could take it apart, we could do lots of things to it. We are living in a world, and we will live in an even more pronounced world, where a huge fraction of our economy will be run by opaque systems. The important parts, the guts, that transmission thing that was causing those car accidents, it's going to be on the data center. You're not going to get to see the code. You'll get to see maybe the output of the code or a little of the output of the code, but you won't know, is that representative? And it's going to be really hard for the next generation of workers, because more and more often they will have to live with secrets that have consequences. And more people are realizing that that is happening, right? That they have a responsibility by being someone on the inside to make sure that the public has the information the public needs to protect itself. And so I think one of the most important things we can do is to make sure that we do education around what are people's rights with regard to, say, giving information to Congress or giving information to the SEC. How do you talk to a journalist? Because without, there's like a think tank for, I think it's insurance agencies, like reinsurers. I know, very exciting. And they talk about the idea of whistleblowers as sentinels, right? They're like, it's not a whistleblower, it's a sentinel. Like, whistleblowers are the people that let us know there's a problem. And the reality is that we collectively are going to be more and more dependent on people like that over the next 20 years.
So here at Stony Brook, one thing that's really important is our tradition in the humanities. And you've talked a lot about the importance of the humanities and how students are trained in technology and computer science, and the importance of keeping people and their humanity in the loop. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So so if for some reason the SEC did give me a settlement, the thing that I want to invest it in is, right now, most engineers don't get to have time to take humanities classes. So every humanities class an engineer takes, beyond the ones in their gen ed requirements, and often a lot of schools make exceptions for engineers. They're like, oh, no, their curriculums are so hard, they don't have time to take humanities or whatever. That we end up creating people who have no context. You know, they're very, very good technicians, and they don't have a lot of context on the rest of the world. And I directly credit the fact that I was part of the first generation, or the first class at Olin. So this is brand new engineering college in Massachusetts. And when I graduated, I had the lightest weight engineering degree you could get in the United States. Like, just to be fully honest, like, smallest list of requirements. I took nothing more than I was absolutely required to. I always thought I was going to go to law school. I ended up not going to law school, so that's just how it happened. But it meant that I took a lot more history classes. And even when I was in business school, I took a bunch of history classes because I really like history. In another life, I probably would have been a historian. But, and I think it's one of these things where we can't do that. It's too dangerous, right? Like, we need to figure out ways where if you get an engineering degree, if you get particularly a computer science degree, that you need to be able to have time to be able to take at least some classes that give you a sense of your larger context in the world. And I think this is gonna sound like a really potentially frivolous thing, but I think would actually move the needle, is I think there should be like movie clubs for computer scientists, because there's so much context in cinema studies around teaching people how to be a human. No, like, it's one of these things, like, if you take for granted, if you are a humanities major, how little coaching a technical student will get in how to wrestle with being a human being. And it's a great disservice to those computer scientists, because they show up as 35-year-olds who feel lost, right? But when I was at Olin, I took we had these things called co-curriculars. So you got notation on your transcript that you had done this thing, but you didn't get credit. And I took a cinema studies one for 4 years. And this person sat and basically like explained human beings to us for a couple hours every week. You know, we would watch a movie, and then we'd be like, and then that human did this, and then that human did this. Why do you think they did that? And the reality is, it's not obvious, right? Like, we learn how to relate to each other's humanity because we are coached. You know, it's not. That's why we make art, to help guide other people on those paths. And I think that's just hugely missing out of like technical education today.
So I see our Dean of Graduate Studies. We're going to be working on that curriculum, so you just let us know when you're ready. And,
that would be great. I'll totally like sign up on it. All CS people should take more cinema studies.
So I have to say your answers are really thoughtful and nuanced. Because of it, we didn't get through most of the questions, but they were really great answers. And so I want to kind of end with one last question. I think it's fitting kind of where the discussion's going, and that is, what is the role of the government in terms of regulating social media, and what form might that take? And more broadly, where do we go from here? Totally.
So I think there's questions around what's the appropriate form in the next 5 years, and what's the next appropriate form in the next 20 years? Because, you know, if we sat down and I did a 3-hour like seminar with you guys being like, here's things that can be done, Like, we can make a list today of being like, here's things that probably should be requirements on social networks. But like I said during my talk, I really feel that would be undemocratic. We don't have enough people who really have the chance to form independent opinions to be able to do an actual democratic process. And so the thing that I'm very firm on is the only thing I endorse right now is we have to have transparency laws. So there's something called the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act. It was written by a professor at Stanford. And it says, like, hey, we have to be able, academics have to be able to get access to data from the platforms. Like, this cannot work. We cannot begin to build like a public muscle of accountability or independent perspectives if that's not true. And so that's what I think is appropriate now. And then I think after we've had a chance to grow, we've had a chance to bring up a generation where they have understanding and perspectives, you can have a larger democratic conversation around, what are the incentives we want to put in place to encourage more social media.
And I think what's so important in that transparency is that then it's not just some individuals being responsible, but it becomes a collective responsibility. And we talk a lot here about shared governance, and listen, universities can always do a better job with that and do that as authentically as possible. I think one of the things that I feel like I've learned is the more that you do that, you do it because it's the right thing to do, but you then make better decisions. You then are now collectively part of a larger brain that's making those decisions. So when you think about that transparency, what do you think are some of the potential benefits of how now we're collectively working?
Totally. So I like to talk about the ecosystem of accountability. So when the National Transportation Safety Act was passed in 1966, less than a year after Nader's book came out, I like to think of that as a trailing indicator. So a whole bunch of other stuff had happened for 20 years to be able to have that law pass after kind of Nader lit the match. Like, someone else stacked the wood, Nader lit the match. And that's things like there were insurance companies that had a vested interest in investing in research into how cars should be built. Because if they could show that deaths were due to negligence, they didn't have to pay it out, right? Or there were academics that had labs that built cars, that we invested in those kinds of technologies. They had independent perspectives on like those questions. It was things like concerned parents. Because you could have immediate context, you had concerned citizens that were really enthusiastic, like Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Today, we don't have anything like Mothers Against Drunk Driving for social media, partially because most mothers have no context. They have no way to even go learn about how these platforms actually work other than going and working at those companies. And so as we have more transparency, and it can be very, very small amounts even, like we don't even need raw data. We can have selective things as simple as if Facebook had to publish the top 10,000 posts every month, or even every week, and then also had to publish a sample, like a weighted sample, of everything that was on the platform. So if you got one view, you have one chance to get in there. If you got viewed 1 million times, you have 1 million chances. That would let us see the difference between what is created and like what is distributed. Like, what's the actual experience of these platforms? And I guarantee you would start to have things like YouTube influencers that would have commentary on it, that you would start to have teachers that taught classes on it. Like, we have lived with so little data that even a little bit of data would be transformative. And so a lot of the work that my nonprofit is doing, it's called Beyond the Screen, is around this question of like, how do we get to 1 million people who would sit at the table? Because I hope in 10 years, we will have litigators that understand what a cut corner looks like. And we'll have investors that understand how to manage risk in these companies. Because we're not just ESG funds that are coming and asking questions. It's traditional mutual funds are saying, we don't even know what questions to ask to assess the risk of these companies. And so all those things are necessary to have safe systems. And every other industrial system that is as influential as social media has that ecosystem. We're just playing catch up 20 or 30 years behind.
Okay, I know I said we were done, but I have one more question. Yeah. So something I always think about is when you start a journey and when you're pretty far down the line, what's something when you're far down the line that you understand just differently than you did when you started?
I think that concept of like the ecosystem of accountability, like the moment that kind of was the pivot for me was I was talking to a large sovereign wealth fund, and they had an ethics board. And we actually had been talking to like both their normal investment board and their ethics board. So the regular board, we were like, hey, you should care about social media because it is a systemic risk against your entire portfolio in Africa, in Southeast Asia, maybe even South America. Like, this is a systemic risk, you should care. And to the ethics board, we were like, you say you invest ethically, like what are you doing? And they were like, we would love to divest from Facebook, but we can only act on things which are established ethical principles. So we've had an ethical principle for at least 150, 200 years that slavery is bad. Like that is not a forced labor is not like a negotiable thing anymore. But we have no norms established around what is sufficient or like what is inadequate when it comes to a social media company. And they were like, if you want help, like holding a conference or something so we can have a conversation around like what does it mean, what should those norms be, that would help us get further down the road. And I hadn't really ever thought before about the idea that like, laws are really just an echo that norms have changed and that we have figured out standards for assessing when those norms are transgressed. And now that's the work that I do, is where I want to figure out how do we get the information out there so that we can have conversations on what's possible, and then we can start saying what should the norms be, and then we can start saying how do we assess if those norms were transgressed. And hopefully we can do that as quickly as possible.
Well, and that's some things in our community that we could be thinking about as well.
Yeah, that'd be wonderful.
So on behalf of President McGinnis, thank you so much for being here with us today. And I just ask our amazing audience for one round of applause for Frances Haugen. So with that, we've come to our end. Thank you so much for being here, and have a great rest of the semester.
Thank you.